somebody from TMPA involved. So I cut out of my other meeting, my 9:30 meeting early so that I could come see you guys.
Well, we appreciate it. I did, just in case on the slight chance you were going to be around, I wanted you to see the school that has 28 national championships in the modern era for football. And I almost put on the national championship ring from the school behind me, but I just didn't think you were going to be there. But that may be too much. I certainly appreciate us coming together live now on Facebook. It is football season, so that's big for us Texans from all of the universities. And so with that, we say good morning, and we hope you're enjoying September. And we are going to get into chapter 143, which we did not last week, which involves municipalities and how the internal affairs process works with them. We do have Clay with us from DPSOA. They have a different format, so that will not pertain to them. And then we'd like to recap from prior weeks what we've discussed, because there are some things that we will certainly look to use and take from those prior discussions on topics that we will end this week with that will build on other topics moving forward. Kevin?
I think it's important when we talk about Chapter 143, as you said, it applies only to municipalities, but it does not apply to all municipalities. Chapter 143 was created by the Texas legislature back in the 1940s, but it has to be adopted by local referendum, by the vote of the citizens in that city. And of the 1,400 and some odd municipalities in Texas that have their own police department, only about 80 of them have ever adopted Chapter 143. So there's still over 1,300 municipality police departments out there that don't have Chapter 143 at all. For example, Dallas has never adopted 143. El Paso has never adopted 143. Arlington has never adopted Chapter 143. So there's, like I say, when we talk about 143, we're only talking about, I think it's right between 75 and 80 cities that have adopted it, either for police or fire or both. Okay. And it applies differently in Houston, Fort Worth, and Austin than it does to the rest of those cities.
Okay, and why with those three cities? Is it population, or is it just what the municipalities have decided? And Doug, since you are a representative of one of those three municipalities, please.
I believe it has a lot to do with the numbers, the number of people that we have here, the number of officers that you have in that particular section. When you take a look at it, it just lays out a blueprint of how it should go. As Kevin has stated before, there's evidence that shows that without these types of protections, you can fire, promote, hire, all at will. So that makes it very difficult, especially in a large organization like ours. We cite in our presentation a incident back in the 30s of all times, in the 30s where a guy went from being a driver to a detective. New mayor comes in, he gets demoted. Next mayor comes back and he's the driver again and becomes assistant chief, and then he's fired again with the next mayor, and then comes back again with the third mayor, ends up going to jail for corruption. Well, there's a reason, because you cannot be one day a patrolman, next day a commander, an assistant chief, and then back to patrolman again, or a jailer or something like that. It completely messes up any kind of integrity that the organization has.
So Doug, this gives protections to the officers with respect to how they progress in an agency.
Correct. Yes, sir. And the sad part is it doesn't apply to all agencies. Again, you've got constables, they're all at-will employees. So you could go in one day and, oh, I love what you did on the scene last night, you're now a lieutenant. And then a week from now, you write the mayor's son or some official's son a ticket, oh, you're back down to patrolman. Well, there's a big difference in that, and there's a disparity that needs to be addressed.
And by the way, I want to take exception to the word protection, because that's one that keeps getting thrown around quite a bit right now in these conversations. Not this conversation, but the national disinformation stuff that's going on. 143 doesn't offer any protections whatsoever. 143 creates competitive process by which you have to go through a competitive process to get hired. You have a competitive process to get promoted. You got a competitive process for pretty much everything there. But it does not protect an officer from being disciplined, from being fired or demoted. It does offer an appeal process, but it doesn't stop the discipline from happening. It creates an appeals process where the officer can appeal that discipline either to a civil service commission, which is basically a civilian review board. It's 3 citizens of that city appointed by the city manager and ratified by the city council, or to an independent third-party hearing examiner that is selected through a selection process that is written out in the law. And by the way, I want to point out, when people talk about the arbitration or the third-party hearing administrator feature, in private industry, and Steve, you know this better than we do, in private industry, most employers mandate when you get hired that you have to sign an agreement with them that you will go to arbitration for any labor disputes that you have in lieu of suing them.
Right.
And so having arbitration in any kind of labor dispute is not unique to law enforcement. It was copied from what is considered these days to be best practices in the private sector.
Right. Well, and a lot of times people have heard that term as in the sports scenario. A lot of baseball players go to arbitration as opposed to fighting out their contractual agreements of what they want for their next contract. And it seems that provides settlement for the organization and the player, so they don't have to have that arduous, long process. One word you said, Kevin, that I grasped a hold of, that I would hope that all these other agencies would take into account, whether they have adopted Chapter 143 or not, is competitive. And, I'm very competitive. And when you have that in a process, I think you get a better outcome, because people now put the want to into it. They put the care and concern into their profession. Without that adjective, I think you don't have the incentives to be the best when you're talking about protecting a community and society that pays your paycheck, and that we should have a healthy respect for, and they should have a healthy respect for those who are paying their salaries. With the lack of competitiveness involved or inserted into this process, don't you think that you can get hit or miss situations because you don't have it?
Oh, and you do, obviously. And by the way, if you will read the preamble to Chapter 1, well, I'll call it the preamble, but the purpose of Chapter 143 is, and it states, the position of the state of Texas, the policy of the state of Texas, is that we want law enforcement agencies that are free of cronyism and political influence. We want law enforcement officers who are out there enforcing the law as the law was written by the legislature, by the local, city councils, by the commissioner's court, and not because the newest mayor came in and decided to use the police department as a tool against his or her political adversaries, which is what happens when you don't have some sort of meaningful due process. And even, we like to think that doesn't happen in today's society. I got bad news for you. We represent cops every day who are getting fired because they wrote the mayor's brother a parking ticket. It's just ridiculous.
Oh, absolutely. And so, I think the fail safes and the safeguards for the officers is important. I think we would ask, as representing the law side and looking at what the citizenry may have a concern with. You mentioned in the appeals process, you have the Citizen Review Board, or you have an independent administrative law judge or something to that effect that you can appeal to. Is there any other way in that process in Chapter at least 143 that there can be, or there would be a reasonable situation to have any more citizen contact with that process? Or is 143 set up in y'all's estimation as
You can
good?
actually change the process by way of meet and confer agreement or collective bargaining agreement, whatever contract system you choose to use. We try to mirror 143 just because it's easier to stand on when you're going to an arbitrator or
Right.
when you're trying to deal with, again, we have a city council and a mayor. So if they want to change anything, they have to come through contract to get it done or change 143. So it's easier to stand on the current law versus trying to stand on a meet and confer agreement.
But yes,
Right.
there are other processes by which you can have other civilian input. And remember, each one of these cities that has adopted 143 now has at least 2 civilian oversight boards. You've got a city council, which is made up of civilians that are elected by the voters, and then you've got the Civil Service Commission that are appointed by that same city council or the city manager. But you can also have another separate civilian oversight board like the city of Galveston has had for years. Other agencies have had them for a long time. Houston has one that was created via their contract. Austin has one that was created via their contract. But Galveston has one that was created by the city and it has existed for quite some time. They exist to different levels, to different degrees of success, depending on the political, oversight that is in place. We've
That's
got
correct.
one going on right now, brand new one in Baytown. The mayor has appointed a civilian a police strategic initiative that he's appointed citizens to, and he's asked a couple of representatives from the police department, and TMPA has been asked to have a non-voting person as a resource sitting on that committee as well. So yeah, it happens all over the state of Texas.
And let me give you a little heads up about the way ours works.
Sure.
We have several different groups. They're called the Independent Police Oversight Board, IPOP. The chairman of each of those groups sits on a discipline committee called the Administrative Discipline Committee. I, as a union representative, also sit on the committee. There's 5 civilians. There's a civilian rep. I'm the classified rep. And then we also have an officer, a sergeant, a lieutenant, and a commander, and an assistant chief on the Administrative Discipline Committee. When we have a shooting, a use of force, anything that's cited regarding force, it goes to the Independent Police Oversight Board. They look at it, make a recommendation for if they thought the investigation was fair. If they had any more questions, they send it back. IAD reviews, gets those questions answered, sends it back to the panel. They in turn make a recommendation or say whether it was a good investigation or not, whether they recommend training of any sort or any policy changes. It then goes back to legal and comes to Administrative Discipline Committee. The entire Administrative Discipline Committee then reads the entire case, cover to cover, nothing's held back. We can see every bit of the investigation, all videos, everything. At that point, we make a recommendation to the chief on discipline. The chief has the final say whether what his discipline is going to be on that case. Ours is a recommendation. So at the end of the day, you're going to have 3 or 4 groups of people look at every investigation. And if someone was cited for it, it will go through the proper chain, and the chief will be able to see the recommendation from civilians, from officers, from the entire command staff.
So I think that's fantastic. And I would almost say if there was a way, even if cities, municipalities did not adopt Chapter 143, some structure that you have in Houston, I think for all agencies, I think would give some surety to citizens that that's going on. The other thing that we've talked to previously is that because there's going to be a grieving because of an incident, is maybe get out in front and say, listen, citizens, we are looking at this. There's information that we can give you, but again, we have internal processes that include civilians that are working hand in hand and side by side. with the personnel charged with our public safety. I think getting that message out quickly and then having some process, it may not be as elaborate as Houston, but I think there is some comfort in knowing that you have citizens and the agency personnel in a room having some very, one-on-one and intricate discussions about the incident. I
Oh
think,
yeah, we fight like cats and dogs sometimes in there.
right,
It's
that's
just the way
fine.
It is.
That's fine. But at least if I'm a citizen of Houston, I know they're working on this and they're looking at it. I think what I've seen the trend be is an incident happen and then it just kind of, again, I've in a different sense and part of the media, that media gets the opportunity to project and that
Right.
riles up a lot of people when your process, at least in Houston, seems pretty thorough. I don't know if anybody knew that that's what the process and the steps were in Houston, giving those types of incidents. If people knew that that was the process and there was an opportunity to address the city and its surrounding areas about what's going on, I think you bring down that civil unrest.
I think there's a couple of things there, Steve. One is people need to understand that transparency is the heart and soul of Chapter 143. Everything that goes on in 143 is open to the public. Anybody can come sit and listen to any Civil Service Commission hearing, any arbitration hearing. They're all open to the public. All the records are open. A lot of cities have gone to the point now where they stream it live on their whatever is closed circuit television back in my day. I don't know what you call it nowadays. But cities have their own television networks, and they're open to the public. We try to mention that to the media as often as we can. It's really not very romantic. It's not exciting or exhilarating. So they don't choose to focus on that aspect. But 143 is all about transparency. I will say this, department heads, chiefs, sheriffs, city managers, very often we believe are far too hesitant to share information with the public after what we call a focusing event, after a critical incident of some type. And I don't know if that's because their city attorneys, county attorneys are advising them to be quiet. I don't know if it's just culture. Obviously there's some things you cannot share. Some things might, in fact, endanger the investigation of any given incident. In Ferguson, in 2014, even the feds had to, and the grand jury had to give some assurances of anonymity to a lot of those witnesses, because those witnesses were having to testify against what was now the common, belief that just wasn't true, but they had to go back and live in that community as well. So they have to be guaranteed some semblance of protection just for telling the truth. And that's why the grand jury process is secret as it is to protect the witnesses, not the targets.
Right, and the other thing is you may not at that point have all the facts. There can be some
You almost never have all the facts because there's a whole lot of stuff, a whole lot of different dynamics that have to be investigated, not the least of which, as an attorney, you have to figure out a culpable mental state. If you're looking at a criminal investigation of anybody, whether it's a police officer or a bank robber, you have to look at the culpable mental state that makes up one of the elements of that offense. And you cannot immediately determine somebody's culpable mental state from watching a 10-second grainy video from a cell phone.
Right, and I'll say this in real time. I've been kind of breaking down some legal principles in a different area of law for someone who's a layperson but is involved with that legal area of the law. They don't know it. It's not going to be readily available to a citizen who now comes in contact, whether it be from an incident with, police and law enforcement to personal matters that are on the civil side. They're not readily available with knowledge that's on their backpack that says, oh, this happened. I just flip open the chapter this or that from the family code or the government code or anything like that and say, we understand what this means. There's always going to be, for the general populace, a learning curve. And Doug, probably to your point, some learning from the officers that have those experiences that are going through the process themselves to be determined, if their actions were in fact just or not. And so do we, what do we do, or what can we reasonably do to get that in front of the citizens? Because I think the disconnect is what creates the civil unrest.
Well, one thing I
Right.
think, and I'm sorry to interrupt, Doc, one thing I think is it's important that we all start to understand that things that we think of as news sources are not in fact news sources. The 24-hour news cycle is no longer about giving news to the public or giving the facts to the public. It's about entertainment value. It is which is why you've got news outlets on the far right, you got news outlets on the far left, and you got almost none of them that are actually right down the middle. Almost none of them that are actually trying. I cannot tell you the number of times that I've talked to reporters about it immediately after a critical incident, and I said, listen, please wait for the facts to come out. And their response is commonly, we don't have time to wait for the facts.
Right.
We have to get a story out there. So they print whatever they can get. They put on television whatever they can get, and they don't bother to wait for the facts to come out. And the public is the one that's now not getting the truth.
Well, I tell you, one that most all people can relate to, especially, again, I go back to the sports example. I remember there was a person from Yahoo News that almost guaranteed Nick Saban was coming to Austin and going to be the head coach. And I remember that was on the front, and I'm like, who is this guy from Yahoo? He says, man, it's a guarantee. Saban is coming. He's going to be the new head coach of the Longhorns, and it's a done deal.
Some guy living in his mama's basement eating pizza rolls.
Well, but he was with Yahoo, which, Yahoo Sports is fairly legitimate. And it hit the front page of Yahoo, and all these sources, again, as you mentioned, will start picking these things up.
Right, but no matter where it comes from, once it's been published, it is now a published source.
Right.
So somehow it gains credibility that it doesn't deserve. And if we find out months or weeks or years later, it just wasn't true. There was no foundation in fact at all.
Well, his wife was looking at houses, or was something like that. And so that meant, a guarantee. And I said, that doesn't mean anything. But Doug, go ahead.
I'm just saying, nowadays, it don't have to be true. It just has to be out there.
So is there something that we can do with regards to that reporting to offset these ends? Because the middle is really where people need to look. And I don't know what can be necessarily created that is very straightforward and practical, but I think it would be tremendously helpful to say, we don't have all the facts right now. We know what you saw from somebody's camera. We're not saying that's wrong, but we don't have all the facts. You have to be a fact finder before you can say appropriately, especially to the levels on the criminal side of the law, beyond a reasonable doubt, that you have what you have. And I think a lot of times when there's incidents that deal with law enforcement, particular personnel, that people see things and then there's a natural reaction to, okay, we should do X, Y, and Z in this situation to these people. I'm not saying that as a human, I don't feel or see outrage when you see things being filmed. But again, there needs to be a process, and we got to understand that the process will get to these issues top to bottom. And I'm not saying that means that everybody just gets to go scot-free until more information comes in, but we have to balance. Again, you have to balance the fact finding with the process and the ability of people to have the opportunity to be that trier of fact internally and with some citizens to know what to do.
We also have to need for good public safety. We cannot just simply hit a pause button and say, okay, everybody just stop where you are, and we're going to wait 3 or 4 weeks or 3 or 4 months until we get all the facts before we start reacting to this. that interim period when the disinformation is going out, very often that's when we start getting the public backlash. That's when we start getting the media, putting out the stuff about Saban's coming to Austin, and people start acting on that as though it is fact. And, we still have to go out and deal with those issues. Our law enforcement officers have to go out and deal with those issues. And if we just assume that every time a law enforcement officer uses force, it's excessive force, who are we going to have left for law enforcement officers?
Exactly
Well,
right.
you asked that question. I think the general public would say, well, I miss Johnny, or I miss the person that is adversely affected because of that incident, right? Because that son or nephew or daughter is important to that family unit and that community. I think, again, the balancing test is going to have to come into play. I think what people want to know is that there's some reasonable assurances that while they see something from a camera phone or what have you that shocks the conscience. I mean, that's what we're talking about at this point. Things that you go, oh, well, we've never seen that caught on some type of technology. That's outrageous.
You're going to see that. You're about to see that from Houston. We had a video go viral recently of a guy that was shot, and it's from behind that they're recording this. It looks like the guy's just on his knees, not doing anything, and these officers just open fire. It looks horrible. Now, when you look at the 20 plus videos from body cameras, you see there's a completely different story to that. And I know.
So Doug, what can we do? Let's take that example. What do we do to balance and maintain civil unrest, or don't create that while and it's great that you explain the processes that you have in Houston, that the civil and you and other law enforcement personnel are going to sit down, review all of this, come up with recommendations, so on and so forth. But how do I keep people inside the loop and down 59? And how do we keep them, in a state of, stability while these processes go on and don't get blown up by all the news outlets that are going to pick up on this story?
Well, I'm a person, it's my personal opinion, of course, that we need to be releasing the body camera videos on officer involved shootings within 48 hours. I don't see an issue with that. Whether it's good or bad, it's gonna be out there at some point. Now, my whole issue with this, if the family requests it not be out, I think there should be some provision to say, okay, look, we're not gonna put it out, but that family has to give us a statement saying, we don't want this out.
However,
because if something happened to me and I got killed in the line of duty, do I want my children seeing that played over and over and over on TV? No, I don't. Just like I'm sure the family of George Floyd don't want to see him on TV every day begging for his life. It's not right, and I do blame the media for a lot of this hysteria, because they will run that over and over and over because it shocks the conscience and gets them more clicks on their websites.
I agree with Doug. We should be putting out, law enforcement should be putting out the videos, the evidence as soon as is humanly possible. However, it becomes incumbent upon our local leaders, our civic leaders, our elected officials to also help explain to the general public why that's not immediately possible, because like he said, we want to make sure that we take the family's feelings into consideration, but also what else is on that video? What if there's a confidential informant in there that we need to protect? What if there's children involved in this particular incident and we want to protect them? We need to protect. What if we have privacy issues that are by law protected? Right. That we have to go in and redact or somehow, edit that video before it can be distributed. Plus, even if we do it in 48 hours, within 48 hours, Ferguson was burning.
True.
48 hours wasn't going to be here soon enough. Atlanta was burning within 6 hours of that shooting. 48 hours isn't going to be fast enough, which is why we have to have more statesmanship, better leadership, And the media has got to quit feeding the frenzy.
Yep. Well, I think even if you have that involved and in play, I think what we've discussed in prior instances, and I renew it, is you have to start having a relationship with law enforcement in your community prior to incidents, because then they can recognize, listen, media outlets' whole job is to push something out for the 6 and for the 10, as they call it, or for early morning, on the way to work broadcast. That's their job. Whether we as practitioners like it or not, or y'all as law enforcement agencies like it or not. But again, there's a way to get in front of what the media does by creating, hey, come here and look at this information that citizens and law enforcement can tell you at this point. Channel whatever news is going to give you this, but hey, we work through the process. Y'all know in the community, this is what we do with civilians and law enforcement personnel. That's where we are. As we go back again, make a statement. Hopefully a media outlet picks up that statement.
You're so old school. When's the last time you watched the 6 o'clock news?
I just watched it. I get that. But again,
who gets their news from the 6 o'clock news anymore?
We can't be futile in the fact that, okay, then we create the social media handle, True Blue News, True Blue and Civilian News, where people can go to that website. They can go to that social media and get a blast about Victoria, Baytown, Houston, Austin, El Paso, Lubbock, Cut and Shoot, Dallas, Aledo, whatever. Eagle Pass.
I've made that argument. We should have a police news network or something out there. The problem is you got to have funding.
Well, some of this stuff though you can contribute, because if people are aware, check back here, it may give them a completely different perspective and interaction where they can maybe ask questions, because you can't do that with media outlets that are just pushing out news. It may need to be somewhat interactive like we have. So questions whether they sound reasonable or not, or they're low level or highly complex, give people a way to have a different outlet besides enrage.
One of the things that Kevin was talking about that came out of Ferguson, if you read the DOJ report, and you guys are talking all around it, is that you either stay out in front of the story or the news media will write the story for you. And that's the kiss of death for all police in these types of incidents.
We are in absolute agreement, lockstep, as the labor representatives. Law enforcement agencies are chronically guilty of not sharing information. Get out in front of the public as soon as you possibly can and share as much information as you possibly can. That is the only way that a chief of police or a sheriff should be dealing with one of these critical incidents. Like I say, unfortunately, very often they're being given advice to do exactly the opposite of that.
Well, and that's on the lawyers in that regard. But again, the lawyers still have a balancing test that you have to look at what works best for the case versus what works best for your community and society. And you don't want the civil unrest while you're doing the legitimate task of fact finding and protecting with privacy laws, witnesses. As Doug, you mentioned, family members aren't going to want to see certain clips played ad nauseum over all the airways and social media.
At the very least, get in front of the cameras and tell the public that. Right. Tell them, listen, we are going to release all this as soon as we possibly can. Here's what I can tell you at this moment. And what I'm not telling you is stuff that we have to hold on to because A, it might help us find the perpetrator. B, we have to worry about the family, the victims, the witnesses. We have to be concerned about the aftermath of this stuff. So we are going to share as much as we can, as soon as we can, but come out and tell the public that.
Very
Tell
much so.
stakeholders what you can tell them as soon as you possibly can.
How can that work on a statewide level, given smaller agencies to a Houston? Is there some blueprint, again, that works for these agencies? Again, we said only 80 have subscribed to passing Chapter 143. Okay, but I think the dissemination of information and the quick, we could call it the 48-hour rule,
Right.
whatever. How can we devise something that gives a B, C, D for all agencies across Texas that at least?
I think it's pretty simple. Every agency under the Public Information Act in Texas, the Open Records Act in Texas, every agency, every city, every county, every political subdivision has to have somebody who is their record keeper. They are the person in charge of, responding to requests for records. Everybody should have their own PIO. Everybody should have a public information officer and a backup public information officer so that somebody's always available for the press anytime you have an inquiry. If you have a critical incident, you need to know in advance who that go-to person is going to be. It might be the chief, it might be the sheriff, it might be Doug Griffith, but the media needs to know beforehand who is the person that we're going to be getting information from. And every agency should be mandated to have two people that have that obligation, that duty.
And that could easily just as easily be the chief of police or the constable for that area. And understand, a lot of these shootings that take place, you never hear about them. Because if they're in small towns or small areas where it's not an issue, you're never even going to hear about it. We have officer shootings all the time, all over the state, that nobody ever hears about because it's not a big city, doesn't make the news. That's just the way it is. And Texas is kind of different in that aspect because it is so large and there's so many counties that you just don't have the same issues. If you shoot somebody in Houston, it's going to be on the news for the next 2 or 3 days, period. And sometimes Harris County will shoot somebody, you don't hear anything about it. But because we're the largest municipality, you're always going to hear about it.
Well, Doug, what about this, and Kevin, that there should be some type of press release that you can go to that particular agency that at least you can count on as reasonably factual at the time it has been released within that 48 hours.
Whoever that public information officer is, whoever that individual is, needs to put out a statement like I said, as soon as possible. They can post it online, they can put it on their Facebook page, they can actually have a press event, but they need to put out something, even if it is a statement saying, we can't share any details with you yet. Here's what we know. There was a shooting in the 700 block of Oak Street at 4:15 this morning, and there were officers involved. Beyond that, we really can't share any information yet because we're worried about public safety. We're worried about the privacy of some of the individuals involved. We're worried about the privacy of witnesses, the families involved. So we are going to get back with you as quickly as we possibly can. And then follow up with that. Tell them I'm going to be back out here at 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock, and I will give you an update. And make sure that they know that you're going to be doing that around the clock, as long as that investigation is going on.
That does give the public reasonable assurances, where I think when you don't have communication, when you don't establish some kind of connect, therein lies the increase of civil unrest. Because as y'all know, there are groups out there that just can't wait for an incident to insert themselves and create anarchy. They look for that. And it's fun.
They will. If you don't set the narrative, they will.
Right. If you leave a vacuum, something is going to rush in to fill that vacuum. It's one of the basic rules of physics.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
And you see this you usually see this more organized in your mass disasters or your big events like hurricanes and things of that nature, where it puts the public at ease. They come out at 10 o'clock in the morning and give the update and then let everybody know, we'll be back at 2 o'clock this afternoon. sort of sets that the public at ease that, you know, if I missed, or, you know, we're going to know what the progress is between 10 a.m. and 2 in the afternoon.
Yeah, minority communities are very uneasy because they're seeing certain things. And it's not just in this part of the country, but it seems to be popping up. And again, we should not and can't ignore it, or we're just going to get run over. And then whatever anyone wants to publish, say, they're going to be targeting law enforcement and saying bad. And again, as I've heard y'all say ad nauseum, the worst thing that a good cop has to deal with is the bad cop. And it's going to stain everybody.
Right.
You know,
but
that's what's happening when you have media that can put some type of sensational thing out there, right, wrong, or indifferent, and there's no explanation. There's no, we're on this. You know what I'm saying?
Right, but the pushback cannot all, you can't put it all on law enforcement to push back. I was listening to yet another talk show yesterday where this gentleman was talking about police brutality and excessive force and mentioned the Trayvon Martin case again as an example of police brutality. And I'm like, I don't know why that keeps getting brought up. There were no police officers involved in the Trayvon Martin case, except for the guy on the phone telling Zimmerman to stand down. I don't know why that keeps getting the Malaysia Booker.
Well, because again, it's cachet to throw things around. I certainly called you, Kevin, to establish order, relationship, and truth.
Right, I'm just saying you can't.
Right, but again, that's media.
The media has to be a partner in this process. There has to be some semblance of public duty from our fourth estate as well. You know, we have to hold them accountable. Our politicians need to be held accountable. Instead of being opportunists and profiteers, they should be more worried about what's good public policy, what helps us maintain public safety.
Well, that's why I think at least you have two areas. You have the law enforcement area themselves, and you have concerned lawyers that recognize that there are groups in our society that may have some disparities that are creating the civil unrest. And the whole idea of this is to find solutions and to establish an open communication so that citizenry can see law enforcement and actual lawyers, Black lawyers, hopefully lawyers of interest, can say, we see what's going on. The norm cannot continue, or we're just going to have a very slippery slope that can result in some bad things.
And by the way, if I haven't said it before while we were actually live, let me make sure I say it now. We really appreciate the fact that you reached out after Minneapolis and wanted to start having this dialogue. We appreciate you and Rudy and Nikki and the fact that you guys have been willing to have these conversations, which can, let's face it, can be very contentious conversations. But I think we have been able to demonstrate it's possible to have these conversations without screaming at each other, without calling each other nasty names. We can talk about public policy and the need for good public policy and even the need for reforms without it devolving into some sort of hate speech.
Well, again, Kevin, I thought that I sat in a very unique position. One, being the committee director and general counsel of the Texas Senate Criminal Justice Committee, I've worked with all the law enforcement agencies that we've had on these lives. Two, I took it a step further, and I actually worked with your organization in particular in regards to officers and their licensures and them being suspended, and then us coming to look at what happened factually and gathering evidence to represent them, to reestablish them within the law enforcement community. So I thought that it would be a real waste of experience if I know that I already have a relationship with law enforcement, family members, including a grandfather who was a police officer, not to say, I've understood law enforcement most all of my life, there's an issue in our country that we can make better, and we don't have to pit law enforcement that protect and serve with communities and society that see civil unrest. If we take the time, you got to put the time in. We've got to look at ways of coming to solutions. Some of those are going to come simple. Some of those are going to be with some discussion, and some of those we're not going to agree upon initially. But again, that public safety and the public policy needs to at least be discussed. And if majority wins at the point, at least we've made progress in areas that we have not discussed openly and look for solutions.
I think we're just about out of time, guys.
Well, let's do this. Just so people know, we have already, and Kevin, as we go down this checklist, we talked about the statewide database for officers, so that would be a transparency action and activity, so that if there was a bad actor, that people would have the ability to go to a central locale to look at things in that regard. We also looked at the use of force with regards to different agencies, due process in regards to different agencies, where in both instances, the citizens and there could be more interaction or possibly more interaction. We have highlighted the civil boards. And now, Doug, you mentioned that there's civilians that work alongside law enforcement, which may be new, and then try to figure out ways to come along to establish possible blueprints or protocols for the smaller agencies all the way up to HPD. And then we also have Clay with us in regards to DPSOA. And Clay, we'd like to next time look at how the government code and DPS interact in these situations, as you are a statewide agency and you're not under the umbrella of municipalities.
I'll tell you real quick before we lose our time. There's a proposal by the Black Chiefs of Staff at the Texas Legislature. There's a bullet list of things that they want to include for next session.
Right.
2 of them are including a civilian oversight review board that has subpoena powers and an independent investigation in police involved criminal cases. So it's not something that we're immune to. It is something that's being talked about that probably came to light because of Minneapolis.
Right. And we do have them on our list, as well as the 8 points that the African-American lawyer section of the state bar also. So those were going to be points that we would discuss throughout here. But since we had you and your agency that is different from 143, we also would like to have you at least have the option of addressing that in the government code for DPS.
Sure.
I would like to talk about changing the time for next week, or maybe skipping next week altogether. We already have a conflict at 10 a.m. next Wednesday morning with something else that's going to be on the TMPA Facebook page. And I realize I'm probably being a little, ethnocentric here, but if we can adjust the time frame so that we can still have a live audience, I'd appreciate that.
Why don't we do this offline, and then we can make the announcement. Either way would work. I know Nikki also.
That's perfect. Let's just keep it for the same time, but we'll do it offline and then announce the posting of it.
Okay, and if it's to skip a week and then come back in 2 Wednesdays at 10 a.m., that's fine as well.
Great.
Sounds
All
good.
right.
Guys, I apologize. I got to get to my next meeting.
No, I appreciate it. Time well spent. Thank you.
Good seeing y'all. Take care.